And we would like to continue to discuss climate changes in our podcast and the policy Israel needs to formulate on this topic. This is a very hot topic. This topic has definitely been highlighted this year in the conference we've had here on the backdrop of the COVID-19 crisis, and also addressing challenges that are not necessarily military challenges, and countries must prepare for these challenges. So we have with us today Gideon Bahar, who's an ambassador and special envoy of the Israeli MFA to climate change and sustainability. Hi, hello there. That's very interesting. I mean, it's very interesting, first of all, to know that Israel has an ambassador and a special envoy who focuses on this. So first of all, I'd like to ask you, how is Israel addressing this issue generally, and specifically, what is your role? So let's start specifically with my position. This position is relatively new in the Foreign Affairs Ministry. It started about 3 years ago, and the role of the special envoy is to represent Israel abroad on topics that have to do with environment, sustainability, climate changes. This entire issue, climate change and sustainability, has become a very important topic on the international agenda. Actually, it's one of the most important topics, if not the most important topic in Israel's relations and in international relations. So it's obvious that there is a need for a professional appointment, somebody who knows about this topic, somebody who knows what mitigation is, what adaptation is, what's going on in the world in this area, so that that person can indeed represent Israel in international negotiations, etc. On top of that, the role of the special envoy, at least the way I think about it, is also to reflect to Israel, towards Israel, what's happening in the world, what are the developments, what are the expectations, what are the projections, and how all that can impact us, because climate change is a major factor that affects each and every area in our lives, whether it's the economy, health, security, the environment, and the way we live, etc., etc. So it's important that the intra-Israeli systems are aware of these huge ramifications that climate change has worldwide and how that affects us here in Israel. So with whom do we work on this matter? Look, we as the Foreign Ministry, we work through our over 100 embassies and consulates that are actually our branches, our arms, our sensors all over the world. We tell them about everything Israel does in this field, and we also suggest solutions. One of the main goals for us as the Foreign Ministry is to promote Israel as a country that is a supplier of solutions to the climate crisis. And why don't you think about it, or maybe our listeners can kind of ask themselves, and or the next time you read a newspaper or watch TV, why don't you try and count how many times this problem is mentioned and how many times are solutions mentioned? And we can see that we hear so much about the problems internationally, but what's missing is solutions for this huge crisis that not only has a global impact, but it affects each and every one of us individually. And Israel, it has the option to promote practical solutions for climate change to the entire world, and 5 main areas: agriculture, water, renewable energies, animal protein substitutes, and reforestation. These are the 5 areas which we call climate innovation, and all of them are at the center of international discourse. Let's say if we talk about agriculture, we have hundreds of companies, hundreds of startups in Israel that specialize in arid areas, agriculture. The world yearns for this expertise. Why don't we take countries in Europe today, countries in Central Europe, for example, the Czech Republic or the Balkans in Bulgaria are experiencing drought, a shortage of water. They must switch to a different kind of agriculture, drip irrigation agriculture, and not just agriculture that's based on rainwater like they used to do. And Israel has a lot to offer in this field. I was an ambassador for 5 years in Senegal, and the main thing I focused on in Senegal, and I'm truly proud of it, and I'll remain proud of it until I retire, I believe, is the introduction of advanced agriculture from Israel to Africa and to places where so far they grew crops once a year in the rainy season, and we added drip irrigation. We brought the experts from Mashab, from Israel's International Aid Agency, and gave them courses. When I came to Senegal in 2006, you could hardly find any drip irrigation there. And then when I left a few years after, you had it everywhere. And let's take water. Israel is a global leader in the number of facilities for water, for sewage purification. I mean, 90% of our sewage is being purified and then reused for agriculture. And the entire topic of water is a huge energy consumer. I mean, it's a very heavy liquid that needs to be transported, and then its usage creates a lot of waste and it creates a lot of greenhouse gases. If the entire world would live up to Israel's standard of 90%, much of the climate change crisis would have been resolved. I mean, the most advanced country after us is Spain, with only 27% approximately of its water are being reused and purified, but all the rest of the sewage is being sent to the sea. And I talked about 5 areas in which Israel is a global ladder: agriculture, water, renewable energies, energy conservation. We have some amazing solutions here for energy conservation, creating energy from seaways, from compressed air, and electric road. There are so many Israeli companies that are active in these areas. Animal protein substitutes. The world currently consumes more and more meat, more and more milk, and more pork products and beef, etc. And the problem is that it eats up all of the Earth's resources. We have to understand that 1/3 of all the land area of the planet is dedicated to agriculture, and 70% of that territory is used for raising livestock. In other words, if we could find a substitute for animal meat, for animal milk, then it would have released up so much territory for the ecosystems to once again absorb the greenhouse gases and for the land to renew itself. And that would have been a significant contribution to resolving the climate change crisis. And Israel is one of the 3 leading countries in the world in the field of animal protein substitutes. It's quite unbelievable, but one of the 3 leading countries in the world, and perhaps even very close to number 2 after the US. So I see that we have a lot to offer. How come the world, I mean, okay, you convinced me that it's such a critical matter, and in a matter of just a few years, the entire world will have to deal with the climate change problems. And you know what? Maybe we can assimilate it to what happened with the COVID-19. It took a while, but now we're at a better situation thanks to the vaccines, and maybe we will soon get rid of this pandemic. But what about climate change? What can explain the international policy up to this point, and what changes can occur later on? Well, I think that this year, 2020, can, maybe in retrospect, maybe if you will interview me in 2015, 30 years from today, that's a date, and we'll both remain as young and as handsome as we are today, then we could say that 2020 was a turning point, because this year is a year in which some very important countries and economies have said that they will reach a zero emissions economy by 2050. That means that the entire economy will be so energetically efficient and uses renewable energies that it hardly emits any greenhouse gases, and whatever it does emit, it can reabsorb. And even the Prime Minister made such a statement at a summit that took place on December 12 on this topic of climate change. So what I'm saying is that this topic of how the world is transitioning to a low carbon economy, or economy that doesn't rely on fossil fuels, this is progressing at a pretty big pace. So, or at least the intention to do so. I think that until now we kind of were stuck. We as the humankind, we didn't really take these measures. But today I can identify some very positive, encouraging signs that we are in the right direction. You know what? I would like to go back to that question about the obstacles, and that perhaps can explain how come, despite the fact that there's such a high potential, it's not optimally used or tapped. Well, the main obstacles, the main barriers have to do with an awareness, because for most people, it's very difficult for them to grasp what climate change is. When you say to somebody, you need to prepare for climate change, that person kind of looks at you and doesn't really know what you're talking about. It's just this big headline. But when we can explain and say that climate change means floodings, and the kind of floods that we're currently experiencing in the greater Tel Aviv area, one heavy rain and the entire country is blocked, and heat waves, high temperatures, the rise of sea levels. And then we say to these people, to these systems we're in contact with, how do you prepare for that? Do you know that, for example, the systems in Israel that are engaged in urban planning, do you know that you need to take into account 4 parameters? That's the rising sea level, the rise in temperature, the increase in extreme events, and less precipitation. How, as a planning system, a system that builds infrastructure, roads, etc., how are you gearing for that? How will that impact you? How will that impact a road, a temperature of 55 degrees Celsius? Does it mean that maybe we'll need to use different materials to build roads? And the runways in the Ben Gurion airport, are they long enough in order to enable flights under such high temperatures? Perhaps we need to update our coastal law that says that you cannot build at a distance of about 200 meters from the coastline. Maybe it should be more than 200 meters. We need to address all these issues. Look, in Israel, we need to take into account 4 main areas in this context of climate change, and now I'm going to specify them more generally, and then I'll give some examples. We need to address what is referred to as adaptation, mitigation, that's the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and also utilizing opportunities, and that's what I talked about in climate innovation. And the entire security establishment needs to prepare for the new technological situation that's created by climate change, as well as new geopolitical realities. Israel, if we're talking about preparation, has to take into account adaptation in each and every aspect of our lives. And it has to come from the level of local authorities. For example, how do you plant a tree in the city? How many trees? Which types of trees? Which species? How do you plant them? How much area do you designate in the town in order to enable water to be absorbed in the ground in order to prevent floods? I live in Modi'in. With every drop of rain that falls there, that hits the asphalt or concrete, it becomes a flood. In the lower places, in the greater Tel Aviv area, this adaptation has to be from wall to wall and in depth in each and every area, and we need to have tremendous awareness to that issue. The next issue, mitigation, reducing the emissions. I said that this year I'm feeling optimistic because, at least on the level of declarations, but I believe it, I truly believe it, that the world has indeed started moving in this direction of massive reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and this transition from coal, gas, and oil to to renewable energies. And here as well, we must understand that this request of Israel, this expectation that Israel will contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, is going to increase in the future. And certain countries, for example, the EU or maybe other countries, will impose a tax, a carbon tax or other taxes and levies for countries that would like to export to them if they won't make any significant effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The third issue or the third topic is using opportunities. The detail I talked about in climate innovation. It's not just about contributing to one of the major problems in the world, but it will help resolve these issues, and it can contribute to Israeli economy and innovation. And let me emphasize, it's not just us who think that. The EU, with its the recovery plan, the COVID recovery plan, one of the main issues there is climate change and sustainability, and the realization that some very important technologies lie there, and many superpowers in the world view this in the same way. And the fourth topic, and this is of course in honor of this platform that is hosting us here, that's the preparation of the security establishment. It needs to prepare in two main dimensions. First of all, it must prepare to the change that will evolve out of the impact of climate changes on this region, the geostrategic or geopolitical change that will be created following the climate change, because an increased shortage or scarcity of water as the population continues to grow in the countries surrounding us, how will that impact their stability? How can we maybe use this in order to build bridges, to build collaborations with our neighboring countries and ensure stability? That's one dimension. Another aspect is the purely military aspect. How do these climate changes affect the military? The Secretary General of NATO, for example, wrote an article about how the climate change will impact NATO. NATO has really gone into this matter, and he wrote in an opinion article and said, we have soldiers in the Iraqi desert. How will they fight or train or live in a temperature of 50 degrees Celsius? It's inconceivable. Your means of warfare, how are they suited to sandstorms? How can you store ammunitions in such high heat, in such great heat? How will it impact your weapons, where your soldiers, and it's difficult to fly? The flight ranges will become smaller. The ability to carry ammunitions will be reduced. And these are all matters that we must be familiar with here in Israel, and we must start preparing for all that already today. So you talked a bit about the superpowers. Now I'd like to pose a question in this context as well, because ultimately it's important to use the help of others and to also implement this policy with our great friend, the U.S. Where is the U.S. at in this respect? And we know that Trump seceded from the Climate Change Convention. I'd like to hear some updates from you now. What can we expect from the future? What can we expect from the Biden administration? Look, this issue of climate change is at the top of the Biden administration's agenda. Anybody who read the platform on the eve of the elections of the Democratic Party, you could see that this chapter, the climate change chapter, is the biggest chapter and the first chapter on its platform. The U.S. is going to really take this very, very seriously, both domestically, if we're talking about reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases, establishing resilience, increasing their technological capabilities, etc., in order to position itself economically and technologically in the world. But along with that, it will also hold many activities in the international arena, the first of which will be, of course, the fact that it will return to the Paris Agreement. The U.S. that left this agreement just a short while ago will now return to it, and it is expected to lead some very significant international moves when it comes to climate change. And it is expected, in my opinion, at least from what we see, we think that it will make demands of the whole world to reduce the scale, the scope of the climate change crisis, and for countries who emit greenhouse gases will have to reduce these emissions. Well, before we finish, the most important thing in Israel in formulating a strategy, and perhaps maybe if we can aspire for a regional strategy, in the context of our accords with the Gulf countries, what should be the main axis of all this activity? We must understand that climate change has a great impact on our region. The Middle East is definitely considered to be a climate hotspot. It is warming up 1.5 times more than the average global pace. The temperatures in Israel have already risen by 1.5 degrees, and the average in other places in the world is about 1.1 or 1.2 degrees. So one of the main ways in order to successfully deal with climate change is to establish regional collaboration. And I can tell you that we, as the foreign ministry, with partners, which is the Environmental Protection Ministry, for example, we definitely aspire to establish regional collaborations in these areas of climate change, sustainability, so that all of us in this region can overcome this crisis. And undoubtedly, the Abraham Accords and all the new peace accords are highly encouraging in this context, and they definitely open a great door for economic, technological, climate collaboration, etc., and of course for establishing regional resilience. And without such resilience, it will be very difficult for us to manage in this region. We will continue to follow up on this important topic. Thank you for coming, Special Envoy and Ambassador Gideon Bahar for Sustainability and Climate Change. Thank you very much.